The year was 1871. Picture a road at dusk, the last light fading behind the ridges, and a lone rider pushing through the Cumberland highlands. He has been days without rest, his canteen nearly empty, and the cold sinking deep into his bones. Then, through the darkening trees, a lantern swings from a post, and a voice calls out. A man's voice, steady, welcoming. He says there's stew on the fire. He says there's room in the barn. And in that moment of exhaustion, the rider feels relief. What he cannot know is that he has just stepped into a trap from which no soul has ever returned. This is the story of the Barrowfield family, a name almost lost to time. They were not outlaws in the way history likes to remember them. They were something far worse. They built their wealth not on crops or cattle, but on travelers who were foolish enough to trust the old tradition of hospitality. Strangers became guests, guests became provisions, and provisions became dinner. You must understand, Kentucky in 1871 was no ordinary land. The Civil War had left its scars. Courthouses burned, sheriffs gone, counties leaderless, neighbors divided. Law was little more than a rumor, and the hills gave cover to deserters, raiders, and fugitives. In that chaos, the Barrowfields thrived. They were predators disguised as farmers. Their home was not a refuge. It was a slaughterhouse with shutters. But this tale is not only about murder. It is about method, about a system so cold, so calculated, that it exposes the deepest rot inside the human condition. The Barrowfields remind us that evil does not always shout or wave a weapon. Sometimes its smiles invites you to the fire and ladles out stew. And before we descend further, I want you to anchor yourself in this truth. Type, the veil is broken, twice in the comments to seal it inside you. Because once we walk into the Barrowfield homestead, there is no turning back. And while you're there, tell me where you're listening from tonight. The reach of these forgotten histories matters more than you think. Each new voice here pushes against the silence that once hid families like the Barrowfields. Subscribe so you do not miss the next descent, for the story we are about to uncover was buried deliberately, hidden beneath burned ledgers, false records, and a century of denial. The Barrowfields were not merely killers, they were record keepers, and their records read like recipes. By the time the Barrowfields had fully settled into their Kentucky homestead, an unsettling quiet had taken hold along the Red Ash River Road. Travelers who ventured near the property spoke of a stillness so profound it pressed against the ears, as though the wind itself feared to disturb it. The forest seemed to lean inward, the shadows stretching longer, waiting. The Barrowfields' presence was almost spectral, visible yet impossible to fully grasp. Nathaniel's sharp eyes, always alert, seemed to follow every passerby, assessing their strength, their vulnerabilities, even their desperation. His sons, Thomas, Elias, and Jonah, mirrored their father's scrutiny, their silence heavy, their movements precise. The daughters, Miriam and Clara, moved like shadows of the hearth, eyes lowered, hands folded, carrying the aura of secrets too old to be spoken. And Agnes, her pale face, her thin frame, was the quiet sentinel of the household, her gaze a warning that everything within those walls belonged to the family, and all outside it could be used. Stories of their neighbors, brief and fragmented, painted a similar picture. The farm appeared prosperous beyond measure, yet its operations remained opaque. Crops were harvested with astonishing efficiency, but few animals were seen grazing. Livestock were uncommon, almost non-existent. The family's coin was abundant, flowing into the local market with the precision of calculation, but never into human connections. They were courteous in public, yet guarded, keeping the world at a distance. Observers reported little more than fleeting gestures, polite nods, and a careful avoidance of conversation that might reveal anything of substance. To the casual eye, the Barrowfields were simply peculiar, strange people in a strange land. To those who lingered, the silence was deafening. It was this very quiet, however, that allowed their true practices to thrive. Because the Barrowfields were patient, meticulous, and unhurried, they could operate in a region where law was weak and neighbors' attention divided. Disappearances along the Red Ash River Road, at first attributed to misfortune, banditry, or the lingering chaos of war, began to accumulate. Travelers arrived seeking rest or aid, and then simply vanished. Clothing, personal items, and fragments of possessions would later be found buried or hidden, suggesting a trail of lives interrupted. quietly catalogued and carefully disposed of. By the spring of 1871, a pattern had emerged that some would call sinister, though few at the time had the words for it. The Barrowfields homestead had become a threshold, a point where the road from ordinary existence entered something darker, something planned and deliberate. To approach the house was to step into the periphery of human calculation, stripped of morality, and the shadows around it were waiting, patient, hungry. Those who glimpsed the family's movements or heard the faintest whisper of their voices often recalled a sense of foreboding, a recognition that behind the cautious smile or the polite nod lay a machine of calculation, cold and precise. If the thought of strangers disappearing unrecorded, unnoticed by law, chills you, take a moment now. Type, "The veil is broken," twice in the comments to anchor this truth within you. And if you haven't yet, subscribe and leave a note of where you are listening from tonight. This is not mere history, this is a lesson in shadows, in the spaces where the world's eyes do not reach. Spring of 1871 was unusually warm along the Red Ash River, yet it brought with it more than sunlight and the scent of wildflowers. It carried strangers, travelers, merchants, wandering laborers, moving along the back roads, unaware that the Barrowfields' property was no ordinary homestead. These were people of no particular note, tired men with empty pockets, young couples seeking work, traders with wagons heavy with goods. All were drawn, as if by subtle magnetism, toward the farmstead, and all would soon vanish without a trace. The first confirmed disappearance occurred one misty morning when a horse trader, Samuel Dyer, failed to reach the neighboring town. Neighbors later reported hearing a carriage approaching the Barrowfield gate late the night before, followed by silence. His wagon was later found abandoned, the horses grazing calmly unharmed. There were no signs of a struggle, no tracks leading into the surrounding woods, just the faint echo of movement toward the house, swallowed by shadows. Samuel Dyer became the first of many, a missing man whose absence would ripple outward, disturbing the local community, though few dared speak his name aloud. Behind closed doors, the Barrowfields worked methodically. Nathaniel, a man of calculating intelligence and unnerving patience, orchestrated everything with precision. His sons executed tasks with almost mechanical efficiency, clearing evidence, preparing spaces, handling what outsiders would later describe as impossible rooms. Within the farmhouse, these rooms, locked and hidden from sight, contained the first glimpses of what the family truly did, a chilling combination of concealment, preservation, and ritualized preparation. The daughters, Miriam and Clara, attended to the meticulous cataloging of personal effects, while Agnes remained the sentinel, observing, reporting, ensuring no mistake went unpunished. By midsummer, whispers began circulating through the nearby settlements. Travelers spoke in hushed tones about the Barrowfields' hospitality, or lack thereof, and a subtle dread took root. Strangers who did not return became cautionary tales, warnings carried in silence: never stray too close to the Red Ash River Road after dusk, never knock on the Barrowfield door, and never, under any circumstances, ask questions that might pry too deeply into their affairs. Even the local sheriff, a man seasoned in rural mischief and violent disputes, hesitated to intervene. The Barrowfields presented as respectable as law-abiding. Any suspicion he held was met with smiles, polite conversation, and invitations to tea that never ended in confession, but always in subtle intimidation. And yet, even as the community turned a fearful eye, the disappearances increased. By late summer, it became clear that the Barrowfields were not merely hiding something, they were actively reshaping the lives of those who crossed their threshold. The house, already a machine of silence and secrecy, was evolving into something darker, a place where strangers ceased to exist, where the boundary between life and what followed blurred. By now, the Red Ash River Road had become a passage not just through Kentucky, but through the Barrowfields' dominion, a road from which no traveler truly returned, and in the shadows of that domain, the family moved with the ease of predators, unseen but always aware, patient but always watching. By the end of August 1871, the true horror of the Barrowfield property began to emerge, not to the public, not yet, but within the walls of the farmhouse itself. The house, ordinary to a casual passerby, had become a chambered labyrinth of shadows and concealments. Behind panels and false doors, Strangers who had once knocked politely on the Barrowfield gate were no longer guests. They were captives. Some were restrained, some sedated with crude concoctions, and others transformed. The family's methods were meticulous. Nathaniel, the patriarch, understood that fear and confusion were just as effective as chains. He had a way of speaking to his captives, drawing them in with a calm voice that promised safety, while every action around them whispered a very different truth. His sons reinforced the deception. Doors that seemed ordinary led to small rooms with iron fittings. Cabinets contained implements that had nothing to do with domestic life. The cellar was a storage of secrets too grotesque to describe casually. Miriam and Clara catalogued everything: hair, clothing, scraps of letters, creating a meticulous ledger that suggested not madness but deliberate cold calculation. The first fully documented victims, Samuel Dyer, the horse trader, and a young couple traveling west, were placed in a hidden chamber behind the kitchen pantry. Here, the Barrowfields tested the boundaries of human endurance. They fed them just enough to survive, kept them in near darkness, and monitored their behavior, noting fear responses and attempts to escape. The family seemed fascinated not by cruelty alone, but by control: how long a person could be manipulated, reshaped, broken, and, in some cases, reintroduced into a twisted new order. Even within the house, the terror was compounded by ritual. Each meal prepared for the captives, each quiet gesture, was part of a system designed to normalize the impossible. Agnes, the eldest daughter, acted as the enforcer, her gaze alone able to freeze the bravest victim. The family's discipline extended to silence. No one spoke unnecessarily, and the few words exchanged were carefully measured, a constant reminder of who held power. Outside, the world remained oblivious. Locals whispered about the missing, but few dared investigate. The house presented a facade of rustic normalcy: laundry on the line, the scent of baking bread, children playing in the yard. It was this duality, innocence layered atop atrocity, that allowed the Barrowfields to operate undisturbed. Even the occasional traveler who passed by sensed something off, a subtle unease, but lacked proof, and more importantly, lacked courage. By autumn, the house had become both sanctuary and trap. The captives were no longer just victims. They were part of the Barrowfields experiment, each day blurring the line between life, submission, and whatever else awaited those who disobeyed. And yet the family's appetite for outsiders grew. The Red Ash River Road was now a hunting path, the farmhouse a predator's lair, and the Barrowfields' power absolute, hidden in plain sight. By late October 1871, whispers in the surrounding countryside began to take shape. Farmers returning from the fields, merchants passing through the Red Ash River Road, and wandering hunters all reported strange occurrences near the Barrowfield farmhouse. Some spoke of flickering lights in the dead of night, others of muffled screams carried on the wind. Still, no one dared approach too closely. Fear had a way of silencing curiosity, and the Barrowfields thrived on it. Inside the house, the family's rituals had grown more elaborate. Nathaniel's obsession with control had evolved into something almost ceremonial. Captives were kept in rooms stripped of any comfort, their minds pushed to the brink while the family observed from hidden passageways. Every shiver, every attempt to whisper or move without permission, was noted in their ledger. Miriam and Clara, once quiet assistants, had become the architects of psychological torment, teaching younger children to mimic cruelty, to obey without question, to see fear as both weapon and shield. The first real cracks in the Barrowfields' facade came in the form of neighbors' suspicions. Thomas Ridley, a traveling tinsmith, had stayed overnight at the farmhouse while waiting for the river crossing to thaw. He returned pale and silent, refusing to speak of what he had seen, but his wife noticed the tremor in his hands, the distant gaze in his eyes. Word spread slowly, enough to make the local constable uneasy. But without evidence, fear outweighed action. Meanwhile, the family's ambitions expanded. Strangers became more than captives. They were experiments in manipulation. The Barrowfields tested their ability to instill obedience, to erase resistance, and to reshape behavior under extreme duress. Nathaniel was particularly fascinated by the limits of trust, how a person might beg for freedom while simultaneously obeying the family's most bizarre commands. He theorized, in hushed conversations with his wife, that true power came not from strength or violence alone, but from bending the mind itself. And yet, even as the Barrowfields tightened their grip, small, almost imperceptible mistakes began to accumulate. A door left slightly ajar, a captive's whispered plea overheard by a curious servant, a young boy's eyes lingering too long on the hidden mechanisms of the house. These tiny fissures hinted at a vulnerability the family could not yet see. Outside, the first threads of an investigation began to form. Ridley's trembling report reached the local magistrate, who sent an agent to inquire discreetly. The Barrowfields, ever vigilant, noticed the agent's approach before he even reached the yard. That night, the family gathered in the parlor, plotting how to maintain their illusion, how to ensure their dark secrets remained hidden, and how to turn suspicion into yet another tool of terror. By the first week of November, the farmhouse had become a fortress of shadows, deception, and silent screams. The line between hunter and prey, captor and captive, was now fully drawn, and the Barrowfields knew that the coming weeks would test not just their cruelty, but the limits of the human mind itself. By late October 1871, whispers in the surrounding countryside began to take shape. Farmers returning from the fields, merchants passing through the Red Ash River Road, and wandering hunters all reported strange occurrences near the Barrowfield farmhouse. Some spoke of flickering lights in the dead of night, others of muffled screams carried on the wind. Still, no one dared approach too closely. Fear had a way of silencing curiosity, and the Barrowfields thrived on it. Inside the house, the family's rituals had grown more elaborate. Nathaniel's obsession with control had evolved into something almost ceremonial. Captives were kept in rooms stripped of any comfort, their minds pushed to the brink, while the family observed from hidden passageways. Every shiver, every attempt to whisper or move without permission was noted in their ledger. Miriam and Clara, once quiet assistants, had become the architects of psychological torment, teaching younger children to mimic cruelty, to obey without question, to see fear as both weapon and shield. The first real cracks in the Barrowfields' fuss aid came in the form of neighbors' suspicions. Thomas Ridley, a traveling tinsmith, had stayed overnight at the farmhouse while waiting for the river crossing to thaw. He returned pale and silent, refusing to speak of what he had seen, but his wife noticed the tremor in his hands, the distant gaze in his eyes. Word spread slowly, enough to make the local constable uneasy. But without evidence, fear outweighed action. Meanwhile, the family's ambitions expanded. Strangers became more than captives. They were experiments in manipulation. The Barrowfields tested their ability to instill obedience, to erase resistance, and to reshape behavior under extreme duress. Nathaniel was particularly fascinated by the limits of trust, how a person might beg for freedom while simultaneously obeying the family's most bizarre commands. He theorized, in hushed conversations with his wife, that true power came not from strength or violence alone, but from bending the mind itself. And yet, even as the Barrowfields tightened their grip, small, almost imperceptible mistakes began to accumulate. A door left slightly ajar, a captive's whispered plea overheard by a curious servant, a young boy's eyes lingering too long on the hidden mechanisms of the house. These tiny fissures hinted at a vulnerability the family could not yet see. Outside, the first threads of an investigation began to form. Ridley's trembling report reached the local magistrate, who sent an agent to inquire discreetly. The Barrowfields, ever vigilant, noticed the agent's approach before he even reached the yard. That night, the family gathered in the parlor, plotting how to maintain their illusion, how to ensure their dark secrets remained hidden, and how to turn suspicion into yet another tool of terror. By the first week of November, the farmhouse had become a fortress of shadows, deception, and silent screams. The line between hunter and prey, captor and captive, was now fully drawn, and the Barrowfields knew that the coming weeks would test not just their cruelty, but the limits of the human mind itself. The first week of November brought with it a chill that sank deep into the marrow, but for those trapped inside the Barrowfield farmhouse, the cold outside was merciful compared to the cold within. The magistrate's agent, a man named Henry Cobb, rode up the Red Ash River Road on a cloudy afternoon, his horse's hooves muffled in the wet earth. Cobb was no fool. He had heard the stories, and though he claimed not to believe in superstition, his gut tightened as he saw the Barrowfield home rise against the horizon. Nathaniel greeted him on the porch with his usual courtesy, a soft smile that concealed the sharpness of his eyes. The agent was offered a seat by the fire, a cup of strong coffee, and the appearance of ordinary domestic life. The daughters moved quietly, tending to chores. Agnes watched from the corner, silent and severe. To any casual observer, the Barrowfields were nothing more than a hard-working frontier family, their home neat, their manners polite. Cobb noted it all carefully, but something unsettled him. The stillness, the precision with which every member of the household seemed to move, as though rehearsed. What Cobb did not know was that beneath his feet, in a hidden chamber, 3 captives sat in suffocating silence. They had been warned, make a sound, and the punishment will be beyond imagining. The family needed to project innocence, and so their human cargo was forced to wait in the darkness, trembling, their lives hanging on their ability to remain quiet. Cobb asked questions, circling around the subject of missing travelers. Nathaniel answered with practiced ease, weaving explanations of river accidents, wandering bandits, and the dangers of the road. His words were calm, deliberate, and disarming. Miriam even offered a tray of bread and butter, her hands steady despite the secret she carried. For a moment Cobb nearly believed them, but then, just faintly, he thought he heard something. A muffled cry, distant, like wind slipping through a crack. His hand paused on the cup, his eyes narrowed. Nathaniel saw it. In that instant, the patriarch leaned forward, lowering his voice with authority, speaking of loyalty, community, and the hardships of frontier life. He drowned the suspicion beneath a wave of confidence, leaning so heavily on charm and control that Cobb, unprepared for the sheer intensity of it, guessed his own senses. By the time he left the farmhouse that evening, he was uncertain, shaken, but with nothing concrete to report. Inside, the moment Cobb's horse disappeared down the road, the facade collapsed. Nathaniel's mask fell away, revealing the fury beneath. He gathered his children and reminded them of the family's golden rule: a single mistake, a single sound, could destroy everything. The captives who had failed to keep silent paid the price that night, their muffled cries becoming screams that would never be heard beyond the walls. That narrow escape cemented something in the Barrowfields. Suspicion was rising, but so too was their determination. The family understood now that secrecy alone was not enough. They would need to sharpen their methods, eliminate risks more ruthlessly, and ensure that anyone who drew too close to the truth would never live to tell it. The farmhouse was no longer just a trap. It was becoming a stage, a place where the Barrowfields perfected their performance of innocence above and horror below. And with winter closing in, their hunger would only deepen. Winter arrived early in Kentucky that year. By mid-November, frost clung to the fields, and the Red Ash River ran sluggish under a skin of ice. For most families, the season meant hardship, lean harvests, dwindling supplies, the gnaw of hunger. But for the Barrowfields, winter was opportunity. Snowfall, muffled cries, long nights, cloaked movements, and desperate travelers seeking shelter provided fresh prey. The farmhouse became a beacon for the weary. A lantern hung on the porch, flickering warmly against the cold, a silent invitation to strangers trudging along the frozen road. To the unknowing, it was a promise of food, fire, and rest. To the Barrowfields, it was bait. Inside, the family's methods grew even darker. Captives were no longer hidden merely as prisoners. They were processed. Nathaniel had refined his system to a ruthless rhythm. Sons lured and restrained, daughters catalogued possessions, and Agnes administered what could only be called judgment. Those who resisted too fiercely were silenced permanently. Those who obeyed, who showed pliability, were kept alive longer, molded, reshaped by deprivation and psychological control. In some cases, these captives were forced to serve, feeding the family's illusion of ordinary domestic life, all while chained to their fate just out of sight. By December, disappearances were too numerous to ignore. A peddler from Louisville, a farmhand from the next county, and a widow traveling with her 2 children, all vanished after passing the Red Ash River Road. Neighbors spoke in whispers by the fire, yet no one dared confront the Barrowfields directly. Fear was their strongest ally. The farmhouse seemed untouchable, protected by the family's eerie composure and the terror of what might happen to anyone bold enough to accuse them. And still, mistakes bled through the cracks. One night, A neighbor boy wandering too far from his farm claimed to see shapes moving in the snow behind the Barrowfield house. Figures dragging something heavy, leaving dark streaks that the snow quickly covered. Another time, a hunter reported finding scraps of clothing deep in the woods, frozen stiff with stains that looked disturbingly like blood. Each time, the stories spread, and each time, the Barrowfields adjusted, tightening their grip, silencing potential threats before rumors could ignite into action. The house, by now, was no mere home. It was an organism, a living trap, feeding on those who entered, erasing their existence, and hiding the remains beneath the rhythms of everyday life. And like a predator sensing the thrill of the hunt, the family grew bolder with each passing week. Their hunger was no longer just for survival. It had become tradition, ritual, a twisted form of inheritance. By Christmas, the Red Ash River Road was nearly deserted after dark. Travelers detoured miles to avoid passing the Barrowfield farm. But some, alone, cold, desperate, still approached that flickering porch lantern, believing it offered safety. They could not have known they were stepping into the maw of a family that had perfected the art of devouring strangers while smiling sweetly at the world. By January of 1872, the land around the Red Ash River lay smothered in snow, its silence broken only by the caw of crows circling above the frozen fields. For the locals, the season was harsh but survivable. For the Barrowfields, it was a perfect mask. Snow swallowed tracks, storms buried evidence, and the endless nights gave cover to their dark rituals. Yet even the most disciplined predator eventually leaves traces, and winter would expose theirs. The first sign came with the thaw of a brief warm spell. A hunter from the next county, Elias Morton, was following deer tracks near the Barrowfield property when he stumbled upon something that made his blood freeze. Half buried in a drift, caught in the roots of a fallen tree, was a scrap of cloth, too fine to belong to a farmer, torn as though ripped from a struggle. Beside it, jutting from the snow, was a human hand, pale and stiff, the skin gnawed by scavengers. Morton fled, telling no one at first, shaken to his core. But word has a way of seeping out, even when fear tries to bury it. Within days, whispers spread a body had been found near the Barrowfields' land. The sheriff, reluctant and deeply uneasy, rode out with 2 deputies. They questioned Nathaniel, who stood on his porch with a calm smile, unaffected by the accusations. He explained that travelers often fell victim to bandits or wild animals in the woods, that the land was dangerous, that the family had nothing to do with it. His words were steady, his demeanor unshaken, and though the sheriff's guts screamed otherwise, he had no proof, only rumors, scraps, and the cold, blank stares of a family who spoke in perfect unison. Inside the house, the discovery ignited fury. Nathaniel gathered his children, reminding them that their survival depended on perfection, on leaving nothing behind. The sons doubled their vigilance, dragging captives deeper into the cellar, sealing new chambers in stone and timber. The daughters burned clothing, letters, and belongings in the fire until the night air carried the acrid scent of smoke. Every trace had to vanish, every connection severed. But the cracks were widening. Neighbors grew more suspicious, watching the farmhouse with wary eyes. Some claimed to see shadows moving in the barn at odd hours. Others swore they heard screams carried on the wind when the snow was thick enough to muffle them. A few even whispered of seeing children. Strangers, not Barrowfields, peering from the attic windows, eyes hollow, faces pale. The Barrowfields had lived for years as predators hidden in plain sight. But with each mistake, each whisper, the veil grew thinner. Winter had protected them, but it also betrayed them, because snow preserved secrets as easily as it concealed them. And soon, what lay buried beneath the frozen earth would begin to thaw, and with it, the terrible truth of what the Barrowfields had been doing behind their closed doors. As February dragged on, the snow began to melt in patches, leaving behind mud, bone, and memory. What the Barrowfields had counted on to conceal their secrets now threatened to betray them. The earth, softened by thaw, started to give up what it had swallowed months before. A boot heel here, a length of fabric there, even the corner of a leather satchel, all half buried, all too easily tied to the vanished travelers whose names still hung in the taverns and church halls of nearby towns. Nathaniel sensed the danger immediately. To him, winter had been both shield and weapon, but spring was an enemy. The family convened nightly in the parlor, firelight flickering across their grim faces. His orders were simple. Everything that remained in shallow graves had to be moved deeper, hidden better, burned if possible. The sons worked under cover of darkness, dragging sacks heavy with unthinkable contents into the woods, digging frantically into the thawing soil. Miriam and Clara tended to the fire, tossing belongings, coats, boots, jewelry, into the flames until the chimney belched black smoke. Agnes, ever watchful, listened at the edges of the property for any sign of neighbors venturing too close. But secrecy came at a cost. Each night of frantic erasure was accompanied by noisy shovels striking frozen roots, the hiss of burning leather, muffled commands from Nathaniel that carried farther in the still night than he realized. And the neighbors were listening. The Ridleys, whose land bordered the Barrowfields, began keeping watch. One night Thomas Ridley saw Elias Barrowfield dragging something across the snow that left a dark trail behind. Another time Mrs. Ridley claimed she smelled burning flesh carried on the wind. They did not confront the family directly. No one dared. But they spoke in whispers to others, and those whispers began to spread like cracks through the community. Inside the farmhouse, fear turned to fury. Nathaniel understood that suspicion was now a living thing growing hungry, impossible to silence with charm alone. The family's solution was escalation. Captives who could not be kept silent were dispatched brutally, their remains destroyed or hidden with more cunning than before. Strangers on the road were no longer lured in with kindness, but dragged in with force. The Barrowfields grew sharper, colder, desperate in their need to protect themselves. And yet, for all their calculation, there was a creeping inevitability pressing in around them. The thawing earth had begun to betray the house of silence. Neighbors were talking. Authorities were watching. And somewhere in the still of the night, the cries of those trapped in the cellar seemed louder than before, as though the house itself could no longer contain the horror beating at its walls. The Barrowfield home was less a house than a stage, and every unsuspecting traveler became a part of the performance. What looked like simple hospitality, the breaking of bread, the offer of warmth, was in truth the opening act of a carefully scripted ritual. You see, the family never allowed a guest to leave with both his body and his dignity. He was meant to be taken, piece by piece, whether in flesh, memory, or spirit. Some accounts describe a strange prayer muttered before meals, not in the name of God, but to something unnamed, a chant that rose like smoke from the dinner table, where Father Barrowfield sat at the head, his weathered hands folded, his children staring with a hunger that had nothing to do with food. Witnesses claimed it felt rehearsed, like every member knew their line, their cue, their silence. And then the eating began, but here's where the story grows darker. Survivors, few as they were, spoke of the meat. It was spiced heavily, salted beyond need, drowned in thick gravies and unfamiliar herbs, almost as if the Barrowfields wanted to bury its true taste under layers of flavor. A disguise, a mask for something unspeakable. And those who dared to question the origin of the meal were met with silence, or worse, a stare so cold it burned itself into memory. Neighbors noticed, too. Livestock in the area often went missing, but not in the way you'd expect. There were no tracks leading to theft, no broken fences, no predators' marks. Animals seemed to vanish outright. And yet, the Barrowfields were never short of meat. They lived well in a time of scarcity, their pantries stocked, their bellies full, while others in the county grew gaunt with hunger. Men whispered it in taverns late at night, voices lowered to a growl. Don't eat at Barrowfield's table. You'll never look at supper the same way again. But by then, it was too late for many. A family traveling through, a peddler seeking rest, a preacher hoping to bless their home. Gone, one by one, dissolved into the soil of Kentucky, their last cries swallowed by the Black Hills. And if you think this was just about survival, you'd be wrong. The Barrowfields didn't kill out of need. They killed out of ritual, out of practice, out of hunger for something far older and darker than mere food. They weren't feeding their bodies. They were feeding the silence that owned them. And soon that silence began to spread. It started small, like a sickness crawling out from the Barrowfield land. Travelers no longer took the main road past their property, choosing instead to cut through rougher, longer paths in the woods. Mothers warned their children not to play near the Barrowfield fence line, whispering that if they wandered too close, they'd never be seen again. And in the town records you can trace the shadow missing persons noted quietly in the sheriff's book, families who vanished mid-journey, names that never received closure. But what the sheriff never dared to write was the truth people were whispering. That the Barrowfields weren't just killers. They were keepers of something, gatekeepers to a hunger that had no end, because every time the silence around that farm deepened, something stirred in the county. Livestock miscarried, crops withered, infants were born still. The land itself seemed cursed, as though the soil was choking on the blood it had drunk, and yet in the Barrowfield home the children thrived. Pale, yes, strangely pale, with eyes that seemed to drink light instead of reflect it. But strong, always strong. There are reports, half rumor, half testimony, of a strange gathering one autumn night in 1871. Neighbors swore they saw firelight flickering from the Barrowfield barn, shadows moving in circular patterns, like dancers in some ungodly ceremony. No music played, but the rhythm was unmistakable. A pulse, a beat that carried across the hills, felt more in the chest than in the ears. And what happened after that night is what still keeps Kentucky men whispering in bars over a century later. Because for weeks afterward, the silence wasn't confined to the Barrowfield home anymore. It spread outward. Dogs stopped barking. Birds no longer sang. Even the cicadas, the eternal pulse of the southern night, were mute. Something had been invited in, or perhaps something had been let loose. And if you think the townsfolk stormed the place, torches in hand, ready to put an end to it, you'd be mistaken. Fear doesn't always breed courage. Sometimes it breeds complicity. Sometimes it breeds a silence of its own. And so the Barrowfields continued unchecked, unseen, unpunished. The county learned to live with the silence, but the silence was far from done with them. It was during this time that the disappearances began to take on a pattern, not random, not chaotic, but selective. A peddler here, a traveling preacher there, a farmhand who worked too close to the Barrowfield land. Always outsiders, always those who wouldn't be missed quickly. Yet, there were exceptions. One boy from town, Thomas Avery, just 13, vanished on his way home from school. His father searched every inch of the county, but when he passed the Barrowfield property line, his dogs refused to go further. They barked and whined, hackles raised, then bolted back toward the road. The man followed, trembling, because deep down he knew, everyone knew. Days later, a burlap sack was found at the edge of town. Inside were bones, small, picked clean and wrapped neatly, almost like a butcher's offering. They said it wasn't Thomas, but the mothers knew better. They knew because his cap was tied to the sack with a strip of twine. The sheriff ordered silence. Do not spread tales, he warned. Do not stir panic. But silence was already the disease. Silence was already the weapon the Barrowfields wielded better than any blade. What terrified people most wasn't just that they killed. It was the suggestion that they shared, that the family table was not just a place of supper, but a ritual. Neighbors swore that on certain nights, smoke rising from the Barrowfield chimney smelled strange. Not of pork, not of beef, but of something else entirely. Something that made men gag and women weep. And here's where the story shifts from whispered suspicion into the realm of the truly disturbing. Because a traveler, a man from Louisville, made it out alive. He told his story in hushed tones, drunk in a tavern 2 counties away, before vanishing again. He said the Barrowfields welcomed him, offered him a seat at their table, and filled his plate with steaming stew. But when he looked closer, when he dared lift a chunk of meat to the firelight, he swore he saw a fingernail still attached. He dropped his spoon. The room went cold. Every Barrowfield eye was locked on him, waiting, not angry, not shocked, just waiting to see what he would do. He said he forced himself to eat, bite by bite, as their eyes burned into him. He ate until the bowl was clean. Only then did they smile. Only then did they let him leave. And he left with one warning, a line that has outlived him. They don't just kill to eat. They eat so they can keep killing. Section 13. The traveler's tale might have been dismissed as drunken rambling, if not for what came next. The Avery family left town. Not just the father and mother, but every last relative packed up and vanished overnight. They didn't sell their land, didn't say goodbye. didn't even collect their debts. They simply disappeared, leaving their farmhouse to rot. That was the first exodus. Over the next 2 years, more families followed. Quiet departures, whole households gone without notice. And with every empty home, the Barrowfield seemed stronger, more rooted, as if the land itself was shifting allegiance. Men who stayed began to see signs they couldn't explain. Slaughtered cattle with no blood in the grass. Horses found dead, their eyes wide open, as though frozen in terror. And then there were the figures. Dark, thin shapes seen at the edges of fields just before dawn. Too tall to be children, too silent to be men. Watching, always watching, yet no posse formed. No justice was sought, because anyone who spoke too loudly against the Barrowfields soon fell silent themselves. A farmer who swore he'd burn the place down was found face down in his trough, his lungs filled not with water but with ash. The sheriff wrote it as misadventure. By now, the Barrowfields had become more than a family. They were a legend, a curse, a whispered warning passed down from father to son. And yet what chilled people most was that they never hid. The children walked the town roads. The mother traded at the general store. Their faces were pale, their clothes too clean, but they smiled like any other folk. That smile was the weapon. It disarmed, it confused, it made men question their own fear. But when they passed, silence followed. Dogs tucked their tails, babies wailed, and grown men, the kind who'd fought in war, felt their hands shake as if a gun were pointed at them. There's one account, written in a private journal, found years later in the ruins of a farmhouse, where a man described the youngest Barrowfield boy. He wrote, "His eyes do not shine like ours. They drink the light, and when he looks at you, you feel as though you are already inside his mouth." That journal ends abruptly. The last words, "They are not hungry for food. They are hungry for us." By 1871, whispers had grown into something darker, an understanding that the Barrowfields weren't merely killers, but that their hunger had become an inheritance. A bloodline sharpened into something unnatural. Folks began saying the children were born wrong, not of flesh and spirit like the rest of us, but of something stitched together in silence and hunger. Stories tell of a preacher who came down from Lexington, determined to cleanse the land. He stood at the edge of the Barrowfield property one Sunday morning, Bible in hand, and began to shout verses across the field. He called them wicked, called them demons, swore God himself would burn their house to ash. But halfway through his sermon he stopped, his voice cracked, his body stiffened. And then, as witnesses later claimed, he dropped the Bible, turned his head toward the Barrowfield home, and began to walk, slowly, deliberately, straight through the field. No one followed, no one dared. Hours later, smoke rose from the Barrowfield chimney, thick, heavy, the kind that clings to your clothes. And when the wind shifted, it carried with it a stench that turned stomachs and made men fall to their knees. The preacher was never seen again. His church in Lexington sent letters asking after him, but the town never replied. They had learned that silence was safer than truth. And yet, silence has a way of rotting men from the inside. Some claimed the Barrowfields could twist your will without speaking a word. That all it took was a stare, a glance from those pale eyes, and your soul bent toward their table. That's why the preacher dropped his Bible. That's why he walked. And from that point on, fewer and fewer dared to cross the family. The law turned its head. Neighbors stayed inside. The land grew emptier, darker, quieter. It was as if the county itself had surrendered. But here's the strangest part. Despite all the fear, despite the silence, the Barrowfields never ran out of food. They never farmed enough to feed themselves, never raised livestock in numbers to match their survival. And yet their children grew tall, their faces never thinned, their cheeks never hollowed. It left only one conclusion. The missing weren't missing, they were consumed. And the Barrowfields were no longer just a family. They had become a feast without end. The strangest detail about the Barrowfields was not their crimes, but their calm. Murderers leave behind chaos, blood, screams, desperate fights for survival. But in every account tied to the Barrowfields, there was only stillness. Victims didn't seem to resist. They went willingly, as though the family carried with them a gravity that pulled people into their home, into their silence. One surviving account comes from a letter hidden in the floorboards of an abandoned inn miles from the Barrowfield farm. The letter was never sent, but it bore the name of a schoolteacher who vanished in 1871. In trembling handwriting, she wrote, "They are not like us. They are not cruel in the way of men, but cruel in the way of nature itself. Like the frost that kills the harvest, like the sickness that takes a child, they do not argue, they do not threaten, they simply invite, and once you accept, you are theirs. I fear I have already accepted." That letter stops mid-sentence, the ink blotting as though the pen was pulled from her hand. And it fits the pattern. People didn't scream when they disappeared. They didn't run, they simply stopped being. Men began saying the Barrowfields were older than the county, older than the land grant that bore their name. Some swore they'd found carvings on the trees near the property, strange runes, circles cut deep into the bark, the kind of marks no settler could claim. As if the soil itself had been consecrated long before the first log cabin was raised. Whatever it wasn't just murder anymore. It was ritual. The family wasn't surviving, they were serving, feeding something older, darker, patient enough to hide behind a quiet farmhouse and the mask of a family name. And here's the detail that chills the blood. Travelers who escaped the farm all describe the same thing. Not just the meal, not just the pale faces, but the sound. Because before the first bite was taken, before the first prayer of thanks was whispered, the family would sit in silence. Utter, suffocating silence. And then, together, they would hum. A low, guttural drone like the sound of earth groaning under weight. A sound that burrowed into the chest and made the heart stutter. And when the sound stopped, that was when the eating began. That humming became the centerpiece of every survivor's story. Not words, not a song, but a vibration. A resonance that made the walls tremble, that made the marrow in your bones feel as if it wanted to crawl free. Some described it as a hymn, others as a growl, but all agreed it was not meant for human ears. What terrified them most was not the sound itself, but what it did. One man said the longer he listened, the less afraid he became. Fear drained out of him, replaced with a calm so unnatural it felt like drowning in warm water. He said he wanted to lean forward, wanted to offer himself like a lamb walking into the butcher's hands. This was the true weapon of the Barrowfields. Not blade, not rope, not poison, but control. A control that seeped into the body, rewired the will, and left you begging to be consumed. And then there were the stories of those who didn't eat. One traveler, a German immigrant passing through Kentucky, swore that he refused the Barrowfield stew. He said he clutched his cross and shook his head, refusing to lift the spoon. The family did not strike him. They did not shout. They simply stared at him in silence, for what he swore was ours. Their eyes unblinking, their faces calm. And then, in a voice so faint he thought it came from inside his skull, the mother whispered, "Then you will feed us in another way." He claimed he blacked out. When he awoke, he was lying naked in the woods miles away, his back carved with strange symbols he never understood. He fled Kentucky that same night, swearing never to return. This detail, these marks, shows up in other accounts. Carvings in the flesh of those who resisted. Symbols older than English, older than Latin. Wounds that never healed properly, scars that carried a weight their bearers could not explain. Some said the Barrowfields weren't just eating flesh. They were harvesting something deeper, memory, will, spirit itself. And if that's true, then the truth is even darker than cannibalism. The Barrowfields weren't just killers. They were priests of something unspeakable, feeding both body and soul into a hunger that would never be satisfied. By late 1871, the silence around the Barrowfield farm was no longer just a warning. It was a border. Step too close and you felt it in your chest. A pressure that made your breath shallow, your knees weak. Hunters began abandoning whole swaths of forest, refusing to chase game that crossed into that cursed land. But silence has a way of cracking, and it cracked the night a storm rolled through Kentucky, tearing branches from trees and flooding the low roads. Lightning struck near the Barrowfield farm, lighting the sky in quick, merciless flashes. That was when two men, brothers, Elijah and Caleb Morris, claimed they saw something no one was meant to see. They said the barn doors stood open, swaying in the wind, and inside shapes moved, not cattle, not horses, but figures swaying in a circle, thin and tall, their shadows bending unnaturally in the light. The brothers swore they counted more figures than there were Barrowfields alive. twice as many, maybe more, and in the center of that circle hung something from the rafters. Not an animal, a man still alive, his mouth gagged, his arms spread, his body jerking with every pulse of that awful humming sound. The brothers ran. They told no one at first, fearing the fate of others who spoke too boldly. But one of them, Elijah, began to waste away soon after. His skin paled, his eyes sank deep, and he complained of hearing that humming in his sleep. Before winter he was gone. His body shriveled to nothing, as if starved from the inside. Caleb swore the Barrowfields had taken his brother's life without laying a hand on him. That just seeing the ritual had bound him, drawn the marrow out of his bones from afar. The townsfolk listened, pale-faced, but no one acted. No one stormed the farm, because by then the fear had grown too sharp, too deep. People understood what they were dealing with was not merely human. The Barrowfields weren't just killing in secret. They were performing something, sustaining something, and whatever it was, they were no longer hiding it. They wanted to be seen. They wanted witnesses. That winter was the harshest Kentucky had seen in years. Snow buried the roads, cattle froze in their stalls, and families huddled close to dwindling fires. Yet through it all, the Barrowfield farm never seemed touched. Smoke rose steady from their chimney. Their lanterns burned bright. Their children walked the snowy paths barefoot, leaving no footprints behind. It was during that winter that the strangest sightings were reported. Farmers claimed they saw pale shapes standing in their fields at night. Tall, gaunt silhouettes that didn't move, didn't speak, only watched. And when the farmers gathered courage to step outside with their rifles, the figures vanished into the snow, leaving no trace. Then came the night of the screams. Not human screams, but something deeper, like the sound of wood splitting, like the tearing of earth. It echoed across the valley, waking every household within miles. Yet, when dawn came, there was no damage, no storm, no explanation, only silence, and in that silence men began confessing strange dreams. Dreams of sitting at a long table, faces they knew and faces they didn't, all seated side by side. In front of each guest sat a bowl, steaming, the smell of iron and salt rising with the steam. At the head of the table sat the Barrowfield matriarch, her pale face lit by firelight, smiling without teeth. Every man who dreamed it swore the same detail. When they looked into their bowls, they didn't see stew. They saw themselves, carved into pieces, simmering in the broth. The dreams spread like sickness, passing from house to house, until even the most skeptical townsfolk admitted something was happening. It was then that a choice had to be made. Either the Barrowfields were confronted, or the town itself would continue rotting under their shadow. But history shows us something chilling. No confrontation ever came. No posse was formed. No barn was burned. Instead, families kept leaving, doors locked, farms abandoned, until only a handful of households remained, and even they lived like prisoners, too afraid to leave after dark. The Barrowfields didn't need to chase their victims anymore. The fear itself drove people into their grasp. And in the heart of that winter, one truth became clear: the Barrowfields weren't just feeding on flesh, they were feeding on the county itself. By spring of 1872, the county was half empty. Where once there had been bustling farms, children playing in the fields, wagons rolling down dirt roads, now there was nothing but silence. Silence and the Barrowfields, always the Barrowfields. Those who stayed began to notice something impossible: the family did not age. Old photographs, rare but they exist, show the same faces across decades. The matriarch's hair never turned grey. The children never grew beyond a certain point. It was as if time itself stopped at the property line. Travelers who dared pass through the area in later years spoke of it as a dead place. The air feels thin, one wrote in a letter, like breathing in a room where something has already died. Another claimed the trees along the Barrowfield fence leaned inward, their trunks bent unnaturally, as though the forest itself was bowing toward the farmhouse. But the most disturbing account came from a census taker in 1880. He was required by law to knock on every door, record every name. When he reached the Barrowfield farm, he was greeted at the gate by two of the children. Except, by his own testimony, they were the same children seen in sketches from nearly a decade prior. Their clothes were clean, their skin pale, their eyes black in the lantern light. When he asked to speak to the head of the household, they only smiled and said, You already have. The man left that very night, refusing to finish his work. In his final report, he wrote just one line beside the Barrowfield name: "They are not to be counted among the living." That line was struck out in the official records, replaced with neat, ordinary names. But the original paper survives, tucked away in a private collection. Proof that even the government brushed against the Barrowfield shadow and chose silence. Because how do you explain a family that doesn't age? How do you explain children who walk barefoot in the snow without leaving prints? How do you explain the missing, the dreams, the hum? You don't. You erase it. You bury it. And yet the Barrowfields remain, not hunted, not punished, just waiting. What makes the Barrowfield case so unnerving isn't just the killings, or the silence, or the missing. It's the fact that nothing ever ended. Families fled, neighbors whispered, records were altered, but the Barrowfields themselves, they were never erased. Legends say their farmhouse still stands rotting yet unbroken, hidden behind a tangle of oak and pine. Locals claim if you walk the road at dusk, you can hear it, that low hum, rising out of the earth like a buried swarm. Some say it pulls at your chest. Others swear it silences the very crickets around you. And here's the chilling part: even today, disappearances cluster near that stretch of land. Hikers vanish. Hunters don't return. Reports get filed. But they sink into the same silence that smothered the story for over a century. The same silence the Barrowfields themselves mastered. Because the family's legend isn't just about hunger. It's about inheritance. About something passed down, not just through blood, but through ritual, through silence itself. Each generation carrying forward the feast. Each generation finding new ways to blend into the world around them. Think about it: a family that doesn't age, that doesn't farm, that doesn't starve. A family that consumes strangers and neighbors alike, but never faces justice. That isn't survival. That's a covenant. A covenant with something older than Kentucky, older than America itself. And maybe that's why their story persists. Not as a solved case, not as a closed chapter, but as a warning. A reminder that evil doesn't always hide in shadows. Sometimes it wears the face of a family. Sometimes it smiles at you from across the table. So if you ever find yourself driving down a lonely Kentucky road at night and you see a pale farmhouse glowing in the distance, windows lit though the land around it lies abandoned, don't stop. Don't approach. Because the Barrowfields aren't gone. They're waiting for dinner.